Good morning, everyone. First one of the day, so it's just me and your coffee. Now, Katie and Greg have given me the very unenviable task of giving you a comprehensive geopolitical outlook in the next 15 minutes or so. And if you've seen the front page of a newspaper in the last week, you know that won't be easy, but I'll try my best. It's no surprise that this year, geopolitical risk is top of the agenda for boards and C-suite. And that's definitely the case for every single client that we advise. And every time I say that, some people come up to me and say, Manus, are you sure you're not exaggerating? I mean, we've always had wars and economic crises, right? And for sure, the early 2000s, we saw several wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, across Africa, saw record climate change, refugee crises, debt and economic crises, numerous shocks. But the difference was that in that environment, you had three really key, quite unique mitigating factors. First, you had super empowered central banks that were providing record liquidity to global markets. Second, you had the United States, still global hegemon, for better or worse, still playing the role of world police. And third, you still had a world where the dominant economic force was globalization, a world that preceded the multipolarity and polarization and mass politicization that we see today. Today, all of that has changed. Those three mitigating factors don't exist anymore. And so now when geopolitics happens, markets move significantly. We've lost that resilience. In 2024, we've entered what I like to call a geopolitical supercycle. Just like a commodity supercycle, a geopolitical risk supercycle is a prolonged period of time where geopolitical risk is consistently high, and that's not just a sheer coincidence. It's the convergence of multiple systemic vulnerabilities, right? It's each risk compounding on top of another. We see in the world today the lack of strong US leadership, for instance. That motivates the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine creates an energy crisis. That creates polarization through Europe, which creates room for China to be dominant, which feeds right back in to lead to weakened US leadership. And now, having planted that idea of the geopolitical supercycle as the defining theme of the year, in the next 12 minutes or so, let me give you a really high-level overview of the 5 things that I'm betting will define the rest of 2024. So let's start, firstly, with the war in Ukraine. If you want to understand the war in Ukraine, you've effectively got to understand just 3 numbers. The first number is 18. According to all the best estimates I've seen, Russia still controls about 18% of all of Ukraine's territory. Russia has almost full control over the provinces of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. Ukraine's virtually destroyed all of Russia's pre-war army, but in that time, Russia's built an entire other one. And that's modern warfare. In the absence of a knockout blow, it's just a war of attrition, a war won by sheer military industrial power. And currently, Russia easily has the upper hand in terms of the scale and scope of its military capacity. Which brings me to my second number, which is 4. Russia has 4 times more active military personnel than Ukraine does. And it's not just personnel. Russia is producing more shells and artillery every single day than the United States and every single European country combined. Putin's skirting of Western sanctions has brought in breathing room, allowing him to triple his defense spending in the last year. He's also enlisting help from abroad. From Iran, he's getting drones. From North Korea, he's getting shells and artillery. And most importantly, from China, he's getting an economic lifeline in the form of $250 billion of aid every single year. And that brings me to my last number, which is $60 billion. That's the size of military aid, the package that the House of Representatives is currently considering sending to Ukraine. And thanks to the baleful influence of Donald Trump and the Republican Party, there's no majority in the US House of Representatives right now that will vote to arm Ukraine. There are all kinds of procedural gambits that the Democrats are using in Congress to circumvent this, but for the moment, none of those look likely to prevail. Ukraine will have to survive without supplies from the United States for the foreseeable future. And so, taking a step back, given that we have a war of attrition, Russia may not have the resources to mount a decisive offensive, but it is well more than capable of grinding Ukraine into a partition settlement. The second war is the war in the Middle East. The war in Gaza, the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, is getting worse every single day. And there's no obvious way to end the fighting. Whatever the military outcome, a dramatic increase in radicalization is pretty much guaranteed at this point. We're about 4 months into this conflict, and so far 80%, or almost 2 million people in Gaza have been internally displaced. It's incredibly difficult to get aid into the region, especially after Western countries have been defunding various UN agencies. Just to give you context of the scale of humanitarian catastrophe, before the war started on October 7th, about 600 trucks would get into Gaza every single day. Now that number is down to 60. And some say that the worst is still yet to come. If Hezbollah, with the backing of Iran, decides that the level of Palestinian casualties in Gaza or the West Bank becomes intolerably high, then a spiral of escalation could turn the shadow war between the US, Israel, and Iran into a kinetic one. All of this volatility has empowered other actors in the region. Since November, the Yemen-based Houthi rebel group has attacked over 30 ships in the Suez Canal. And in response, the US has formed a multinational naval task force to protect shipping and deter the Houthis. But this Yemeni group remains undeterred and continues to shoot. And in doing so, it risks inadvertently killing American citizens and soldiers, which would demand a stronger response from Washington, bringing the United States directly into the region. And finally, the third war is one that I don't think people often think of as a war necessarily, but that's the United States' war against itself. Fully 1/3 of the global population is going to the polls this year, but an unprecedentedly dysfunctional US election will be by far the most consequential for the world's security, stability, and economic outlook. The outcome will affect the fate of over 8 billion people. And just 160 million Americans will have a say in it, but the winner is going to be decided by just tens of thousands of votes in very key swing states. Today we're standing just a week before Super Tuesday in the United States. Trump is well on his way to gaining the Republican nomination. Remember, most of his Republican competitors dropped out before a single delegate vote in the primaries was even counted. And then he won the Iowa caucus, which is about the best leading political indicator you have in the United States. And then just last week, he absolutely crushed Nikki Haley in South Carolina. If Trump wins, and if you believe the pollsters, that looks increasingly likely, then that means that certainly means handing a massive win to the Russians in Ukraine, but it also means that the United States instantly plunges itself and the rest of the world into geopolitical recession, possibly economic recession, if we see anything close to the 60% tariffs that he wants to apply across the board on China. Now, don't get me wrong, Trump still has no shortage of hurdles before him before going head-to-head with Biden. And after all, he has 4 really serious lawsuits against him that he has to fight. A lot could still happen to mobilize the swing vote against him in the next 9 months. But I think that the biggest risk is that no matter who wins, whether Republican or Democrat, will consider the outcome illegitimate and be unprepared to accept it. The world's most powerful country today faces critical challenges to its core political institutions, free and fair elections, the peaceful transfer of power, and the checks and balances provided by the separation of powers. That's pretty much been totally unprecedented in the last 75 years or so. Now, every time I speak at Finovate, I fear I'm the bearer of all doom and gloom. And our clients always ask us, what's the good news? Is there a silver lining to any of this? And there certainly is. Let me talk about 2 of those things. The first is the US-China relationship. For once, it's very unlikely to be a risk. The US and China will be adults in the room this year. With all the fighting going on across the world, the 2 biggest economies are not looking for reasons to start another conflict, despite the lack of trust and mutually unaligned political and economic systems. For the last 5 years, at places like Davos and the World Economic Forum, the US-China relationship was constantly touted as one that was always on the brink of failure. This year, I didn't hear a single mention of it. And in part, that's because the Chinese economy and the US domestic polity is so deeply troubled and distracted. I've just talked about the Americans. In China, we've got record high youth unemployment at 20%. We've got a collapsing property market, a country that's still struggling to get foreign investment effectively into the country, and a country that still doesn't have control over the most critical supply chain, semiconductors, something that's still dominated by the US and Taiwan. It simply doesn't have the breathing room to pick fights like it did before, particularly in the run-up to the American elections. But the second thing that makes me fairly optimistic is the future of emerging markets this year. In a record election year, most countries in emerging markets will have fairly unproblematic and straightforward elections. Whether that's the recent elections in Taiwan and Indonesia, which went far better than they could have gone, or the upcoming ones in places like India and Mexico. Most importantly, I think we'll also see the rise of what I like to call geopolitical swing states. This is a growing group of countries, almost all of them in emerging markets, that are not specifically aligned with either the United States or China. Countries with resources across the energy supply chain are going to play a much more important role in 2024. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE will play a dominant role in Middle Eastern geopolitics, like they already are in negotiating with the Israelis. Turkey is going to continue to be a key mediating force between Russia and Ukraine. India is going to continue to strengthen its defense partnerships with the West while improving its economic partnerships with the rest of the world, particularly in the global South. And at the end of the year, all our eyes will be on Brazil as it takes center stage by taking on the presidency of the COP summit, seeking to elevate Latin America's role in the world, specifically to do with environmental issues. So, if you take away anything from this talk, I want you to remember these 5 broad trends that'll define the geopolitical supercycle of 2024. First, the war in Ukraine will become a war of attrition where Western support becomes more important than ever. Second, the war in Gaza risks escalation by turning into a much bigger regional war if Iran and Hezbollah decide to get directly involved, or if the Houthis continue to stay empowered. And third, a Trump presidency could very well thrust the world into geopolitical and economic recession. But even if he doesn't win, the real risk is the prospect of half a country refusing to accept election results that will permanently tarnish American political institutions. But on the bright side, the US-China relationship will be a source of stability. And lastly, emerging markets have a pretty strong economic outlook. They're finding their feet, and they're playing mediating roles in global conflicts. So there's still quite a bit to look forward to. Thank you very much.